The dusty frontier town of Silveridge had seen its share of morally questionable events, but the auction that took place on that scorching August afternoon in 1882 would become a turning point that nobody could have predicted. Samuel Sam Hawthorne, a weathered rancher known more for his silence than his opinions, stood at the edge of the crowd gathered in the town square, watching something that made his stomach turn. A Chinese woman, barely into her 20s, stood on the auction platform. Her eyes were cast downward, her hands bound loosely in front of her. She wore a tattered pink silk dress that had once been beautiful, now stained with the dust of hard travel. The auctioneer, a rotund man named Calloway who usually sold livestock and farming equipment, was treating her sale with the same casual indifference he'd show a horse or a plow. $7. Calloway barked. Do I hear $7 for this here Chinese girl? She can cook, clean, and she don't talk back, don't speak much English at all. $7, gentlemen. The crowd was a mix of curious onlookers and a few unsavory characters who saw an opportunity for cheap labor or worse. Sam felt bile rise in his throat. He'd fought in the war, seen terrible things, but this was different. This was happening in his town, in broad daylight, and people were acting like it was normal. What most people didn't know was that the woman, whose name was Mei Lin, had been brought to America by labor contractors who promised her family she'd work as a seamstress in San Francisco. Instead, she'd been sold into servitude, passed from one owner to another, each transaction taking her further from any hope of freedom. The current owner, a saloon keeper from a neighboring town, had decided she was more trouble than she was worth after she'd refused his advances and was now liquidating his asset. $6, someone shouted from the crowd, a miner known for his cruelty to the Chinese workers in his employ. Sam's jaw clenched. He thought of his own daughter, who died of fever 10 years ago. She would have been about this Chinese woman's age now. He thought of his late wife, who'd always taught him that silence in the face of wrong was the same as participation. $7, Sam's voice cut through the crowd, rough and firm. Heads turned. People knew Sam Hawthorne as a man who kept to himself, who ran his ranch with quiet efficiency and didn't involve himself in town politics. His bid surprised everyone. $7 to Mr. Hawthorne. Calloway seemed eager to close the deal. Going once, going twice, sold. Sam pushed through the crowd and paid the money, his face expressionless even as shame burned in his chest. He'd just purchased a human being for the price of a good saddle. The paperwork Calloway handed him, fraudulent documents claiming this was a legal indenture contract, felt like poison in his hands. He approached Mei Lin carefully, seeing the fear in her eyes as he untied her hands. I'm not going to hurt you, he said quietly, though he wasn't sure how much she understood. You're coming with me. The ride back to his ranch was silent. Mei Lin sat rigidly in the wagon, her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully blank. Sam wondered what horrors she'd already endured, what she expected would happen next. When they arrived at his modest ranch house, Sam did something that surprised them both. He gestured for her to sit at his kitchen table, not as a servant, but as a guest. He put on coffee and, through a combination of simple words and gestures, tried to communicate something that seemed impossible given the circumstances. She was free. You work if you want, he said slowly, pointing around the house. You get wages. Real money. You can leave any time. He pulled out a map and pointed to San Francisco, where he knew there was a Chinese community. I can take you here. Or you stay, you work, you get paid. Your choice. Mei Lin studied him with intelligent, wary eyes. She'd learned not to trust the promises of white men. But something in Sam's face, the genuine discomfort, the shame, the determination, made her pause. She said something in Cantonese that he didn't understand, then slowly nodded. That night, Sam gave her the spare bedroom, the one that had belonged to his daughter. He locked his own door from the outside and left the key on her side, a gesture meant to show she controlled her own safety. It was a small thing, but it was something. Word spread quickly through Silveridge. By morning, the whole town knew that Sam Hawthorne had bought the Chinese woman and taken her to his ranch. The interpretations of his actions varied wildly, and most of them were ugly. Some assumed he'd purchased her for immoral purposes. Others were simply outraged that he'd spent money on a Chinese person at all. The town's growing anti-Chinese sentiment, fueled by economic anxiety and racism, found a new target. By the second day, a group had formed. Led by Marcus Pike, an influential landowner who'd been vocal about wanting to drive all Chinese residents out of the county, about 30 men gathered at the saloon. They drank, worked themselves into a fury with racist rhetoric and wild speculation about what Sam was doing with that Chinese woman, and decided that something had to be done. "We can't have this kind of thing in our town," Pike declared, his face red with whiskey and rage. "First, Hawthorne buys a Chinese girl like she's people, and next thing you know, they'll all think they can just live among us like equals." The mob formed in the late afternoon, armed with rifles, torches, and righteous indignation. They rode out to the Hawthorne ranch as the sun began to set, their numbers swollen by men who just wanted excitement and violence, regardless of the cause. Sam saw them coming from a distance. He'd half expected this, had seen the ugly looks in town, heard the whispers. He'd prepared as best he could. He stepped out onto his porch, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground. Mei Lin was inside, and he'd told her to hide in the root cellar if trouble came. "That's far enough," Sam called out as the mob approached his property line. His voice was steady, but his heart pounded in his chest. Marcus Pike rode forward as the mob spokesman. "Hawthorne, we're here for the Chinese girl. This has gone far enough. You've made your point, whatever it was, but it's time to hand her over." "Hand her over to who? For what?" Sam's voice was cold. "Last I checked, I paid for her fair and square. Got papers and everything. Those papers don't mean she's a person, Sam. She's Chinese. We all know what you really bought her for, and we're not going to stand by while I what?" Sam interrupted, his anger finally showing. "While I give her honest work and fair wages. While I treat her like a human being. That what you can't stand." "She's not human, not like us," someone shouted from the crowd. "And you're a traitor to your race for treating her like she is." What happened next would become the subject of debate and legend in Silveridge for years to come. Sam Hawthorne did something that nobody expected. He told them the truth. "You want to know why I bought her?" Sam's voice rang out across his property. "I bought her because I was ashamed. Ashamed that in my town, in my America, we were standing around watching a human being sold like cattle. Ashamed that I fought in a war supposedly about freedom, and here we are, still trading in human lives. I bought her because it was wrong, and somebody had to do something." He paused, his rifle still lowered but his stance firm. "Her name is Mei Lin. She was lied to, trafficked here, and sold multiple times like she was property. And yes, I paid $7 for her. $7 that should shame every one of us that's what we value a human life at. But the moment that transaction was complete, I freed her. She works for me now by choice, for fair wages, and she can leave any time she wants." "You're a liar!" Pike shouted. "Chinese can't be trusted, and neither can anyone who sides with them." The mob began to surge forward, but then something unexpected happened. Sheriff Tom Crawford, who'd gotten word of the mob's intentions, arrived with a handful of deputies. But more surprisingly, about a dozen other ranchers and townspeople arrived with him. People who'd been troubled by the auction, who'd been quietly disgusted by the growing violence against Chinese residents, but who'd stayed silent until now. "That's enough!" Sheriff Crawford's voice boomed. "I don't care what you think about the Chinese or about Sam's choices. This is his property, and you're trespassing. More than that, you're threatening a man's life over something that's none of your business." "The law doesn't protect Chinese," someone yelled. "Maybe not enough," Crawford admitted, surprising everyone. "But it protects Sam Hawthorne, and it protects people on his property. And I'm here to enforce it." Old Jim Patterson, a respected retired rancher, rode forward from the group that had come with the sheriff. "Marcus, I've known you since you were a boy. Your father would be ashamed of this. We've all done things we're not proud of, turned blind eyes to injustices because they were convenient. But Sam Hawthorne stood up and did something when the rest of us just watched. Maybe it's time we started asking ourselves why that makes us so angry." The tension hung thick in the air. For a long moment, It could have gone either way, violence or retreat. Then, slowly, some of the men at the back of the mob began to turn their horses around. They'd come for excitement, not for a real confrontation with the law and armed defenders. Pike's face was purple with rage, but he could see the moment slipping away. "This isn't over," he spat at Sam. "You've made yourself an enemy of decent people." "If decent people think buying and selling human beings is acceptable," Sam replied quietly, "then I'm proud to be their enemy." The mob dispersed slowly, reluctantly. Some men left genuinely thoughtful, questioning the righteousness of their cause for the first time. Others left angry, their prejudices only reinforced. But they left. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened in Silveridge. The incident forced conversations that people had been avoiding. Some townspeople began questioning the treatment of Chinese workers in their community. Others doubled down on their prejudice. The town split along ideological lines that had always existed but had never been so clearly defined. Mei Lin stayed at the Hawthorne Ranch. Sam kept his word. She was paid fairly for her work and was free to leave. But over time, she chose to stay. She taught Sam some Cantonese, and her English improved rapidly. She told him her story, of a family back in Guangdong province who thought she'd gone to find prosperity in Gold Mountain, who had no idea of the nightmare she'd endured. Sam used his connections to help other Chinese workers in the area, providing fair employment when others wouldn't. He testified in court cases about the illegal trafficking that had brought Mei Lin to America, helping to shut down one of the networks that traded in human lives. His testimony was groundbreaking. A white rancher speaking on behalf of Chinese victims was almost unheard of. Not everyone in Silveridge changed their minds. Marcus Pike continued his campaign of hatred until his death. But enough people were moved by Sam's example that slowly, incrementally, conditions for Chinese residents began to improve in that small corner of the frontier. Years later, Mei Lin would tell her own children and grandchildren, children born free in California after she'd eventually married a merchant from San Francisco's Chinatown, about the quiet rancher who'd spent $7 to make a point. She'd say that Sam Hawthorne wasn't a perfect man, and his buying her, even with good intentions, was still part of a deeply broken system. But he'd been a man willing to risk everything to do what he believed was right, and sometimes, in dark times, that kind of courage was enough to start a change. Sam never thought of himself as a hero. He'd tell anyone who asked that he'd simply done what his conscience demanded. But in a time and place where silence was easy and speaking up was dangerous, Sam Hawthorne had chosen to act, and that choice had echoed far beyond his quiet ranch on the edge of Silveridge. The $7 he'd spent that day was the best investment he'd ever made. Not in property or labor, but in standing up for the principle that every human life has value beyond what can be measured in dollars and cents.